Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Kristen.
And my name is Katie. And we want to spend a few minutes a day with you walking through the New Testament, one chapter at a time. This year, we will fix our gaze upon Christ so that we may know him, not only with our minds, but with our hearts.
Together, we will learn that who Jesus is changes everything.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. My name is Katie, and it is my privilege to walk with you through the Gospel of Mark. Today, we are diving into Mark 8. This chapter opens up with another miraculous feeding of a huge crowd. In Mark 6, we saw Jesus feeding 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Here, he feeds 4,000 with 7 loaves. But there's something noteworthy about the differences between these two events. In this scene, the crowd has been with him for much longer, 3 days rather than a few hours. And there is no mention here of nearby villages where the people could disperse to go eat. So it's much more urgent of a situation. Another big difference is the crowd itself. Jesus was still in the Decapolis, a largely Gentile region. And while he was primarily feeding Jews in Mark 6, here he is feeding a crowd that is predominantly Gentile. There were likely some Jews present, but they're probably in the minority. It's interesting to consider this scene in light of Jesus' encounter with the woman yesterday, who begged him to heal her daughter. This woman, a Gentile, said that even dogs share in the children's bread as it falls to the ground. And here, Jesus is giving bread to the quote-unquote dogs, the Gentiles. Jesus is showing the world that he is not only the Savior of the Jewish people, he is the Savior of the world. And right after this, we get a brief encounter with the Pharisees, which sets up for an important conversation with the disciples. The Pharisees approach Jesus and ask him for a sign from heaven. They are not asking for a miracle here. They've seen Jesus perform miracles, but they are asking him for proof that his miracles are from God. Basically, they're saying, prove that God is with you. But Jesus knows that they are not genuinely curious. They are just trying to discredit him. They've already seen him work and have enough evidence to know that God is with Jesus. And yet, as we saw in Mark 3, they attributed Jesus' power to Satan. And that leads to the scene in the boat where the disciples realize that they only brought 1 loaf of bread to eat, to which Jesus responds by telling them, beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. Leaven, or yeast, often represents bad moral influence in the Bible. And Jesus is warning them not to be infected by the Pharisees' blindness, which they were in danger of doing. How so? Well, they have now seen Jesus twice feed a huge crowd with very little bread, and now they are complaining about not having enough bread. Do they honestly think that this is a problem for a man like Jesus? Like the Pharisees, they are in danger of missing what the feedings make clear, that Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is doing what God did for Israel long before. He is feeding them in the wilderness. But like the Pharisees, they are missing this, and Jesus calls them blind and deaf. We then see Jesus heal a blind man. This healing might feel both a little bit out of place and a little bit in odds with its details, but it is very strategically placed here by Mark because it explains the events to follow. This account is similar to the healing of the deaf man in Mark 7. This man is brought to Jesus by others. Jesus leads him away from the crowd, spit is involved, and based on this man's comment about trees, he probably wasn't born blind. What's significant, though, is that this healing happens in 2 stages. Jesus touches him once and partially heals him. He can see, but not clearly. Only after the second touch can he see clearly. Mark isn't interested in why it took 2 touches to fully restore the blind man's sight. But here is what he is interested in. Jesus has just called his disciples deaf and blind. We've seen Jesus heal a deaf man, and now we've seen him gradually restore a blind man's sight. Mark wants us to have this perspective fresh in our minds when we read the next scene. Now Jesus asks his disciples who people are saying he is, and they tell him what rumors are going around. Maybe he's John the Baptist, Elijah, one of the prophets. Then Jesus asks him, "Who do you say I am?" And Peter replies, "You are the Messiah." That is, you are God's appointed agent. You are the one through whom all of God's promises will be fulfilled. You are the realization of all of Israel's hope and dreams. This is a huge moment in Mark's gospel. This is the first time since the very first verse that Jesus has been referred to as the Messiah. And this was a misunderstood term in Jesus' day, which is why he commands the disciples to be silent about this. Many thought the Messiah would be a military leader who would drive out Rome from Israel. Peter's confession is correct. Jesus is the Messiah. But now the Gospel of Mark shifts to focus on what kind of Messiah Jesus is. Jesus now begins to explain that as the Messiah, he will suffer and die. Not only that, but to be his disciple, to follow him, means that we can expect to suffer as well. And Peter is not on board with this. He rebukes Jesus for saying this, only to get a strong counter rebuke from him. Peter just had a high, followed by a very low low. And there's significance of the blind man's 2-stage healing. Peter can partially see. He sees that Jesus is the Messiah, but he can't see it clearly yet. He can't comprehend a suffering Messiah. And for that, he awaits a second touch that will enable him to see clearly. And so as we see or behold Jesus in this passage, let us do so with clear vision. He is the Messiah, the one through whom God is restoring sinners to himself and righting all the wrongs of this world. But let us also see that he suffered for us to bring peace with God, and that to follow him, we too will suffer in this life. But it is worth it, friend, because glory and not suffering is the ultimate destination of the path Jesus walked, and the path that he calls us to walk as well. And he promised to never leave us or forsake us as we follow this path home. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. Don't forget to check out the show notes for helpful links and resources related to today's episode. And make sure you are following at Daily Grace Podcast on Instagram for more A Year in the Bible content, and at the Daily Grace Co. for all things Bible study resources. We can't wait to study again with you tomorrow. Bye, friends.